Hey there, history lovers. Tonight we're diving into something a little different, something that might make your stomach growl and simultaneously turn in equal measure. We're exploring the surprisingly sordid world of ancient Greek street food, where democracy was born alongside dysentery, and philosophers debated the meaning of life while dodging flying olive pits from angry vendors. Before we begin this aromatic journey through antiquity, take a moment to like the video. If you enjoy having your preconceptions about classical civilization thoroughly seasoned with reality, subscribe if you want more stories about how our ancestors lived, loved, and most importantly, ate in ways that would horrify modern health inspectors. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world, probably while snacking on something infinitely safer than what we're about to discuss. Now settle in, maybe grab a light snack, though you might want to keep it simple tonight. Turn on that fan for some background white noise, dim the lights, and let's wander together through the smoky, chaotic, absolutely filthy streets of ancient Athens, where civilization and food poisoning walked hand in greasy hand. Picture this, it's 430 BCE, the sun is setting over the Acropolis, casting long shadows across the agora, and the air is thick with smoke, steam, and the unmistakable aroma of questionable meat sizzling over charcoal fires. This isn't the pristine marble paradise of your high school textbooks. This is the real Athens, where Socrates himself probably grabbed a quick bite from a street vendor before heading off to corrupt the youth with uncomfortable questions about virtue, where Pericles, architect of the Golden Age, might have wolfed down a greasy pastry between speeches about democracy and imperial expansion. The ancient Greeks, those paragons of philosophy and proportion, those inventors of theatre and democracy, had a secret that classical scholars prefer to whisper about in footnotes. They were absolutely obsessed with fast food. Not the gleaming, regulated chains we know today, but a chaotic network of street vendors, tavern keepers, and entrepreneurial cooks who turned ancient cities into aromatic mazes of questionable cuisine. These weren't quaint farmers' markets with artisanal olive oil and organic figs. These were grimy, crowded, often dangerous commercial districts where fortunes were made and lost over bowls of lentil soup, where reputations could be destroyed by a bad batch of fish sauce, and where the line between nourishment and poison was often thinner than phyllo dough. The Greeks called their street food vendors kapaloi, a term that carried about as much respect as fast food worker does today. These were the working class heroes and villains of ancient urban life, feeding the masses while being simultaneously essential and despised by polite society. But here's where it gets interesting, in that uniquely Greek way where everything becomes a philosophical debate. Even their junk food became entangled with ideas about virtue, class, and the proper way to live. Plato himself spent considerable time ranting about the corrupting influence of fancy cooking, apparently believing that elaborate seasoning led directly to moral decay. Aristotle, never one to be outdone by his teacher, developed theories about the relationship between diet and character that would make modern nutritionists weep with recognition. The man who categorized everything from politics to poetics also had opinions about whether eating street food made you a worse person. Meanwhile, ordinary Athenians just wanted lunch. They wanted something hot, filling, and cheap that they could eat while conducting business, gossiping with neighbors, or watching the latest tragedy unfold in the theatre district. They wanted convenience food, and by Zeus, they were going to get it. The result was a thriving, chaotic, absolutely fascinating food culture that combined the best and worst of human ingenuity. Street vendors developed preservation techniques that kept food edible in Mediterranean heat without refrigeration. They created portable cooking equipment that could be set up anywhere there was foot traffic. They invented the ancient equivalent of food trucks, except instead of following festivals and concerts, they followed armies, political rallies, and religious processions. Where crowds gathered, food vendors appeared like mushrooms after rain, ready to feed anyone with a few coins and a strong stomach. The Agora of Athens wasn't just a marketplace for goods and ideas. It was ground zero for a culinary revolution that would influence eating habits across the Mediterranean for centuries. Here, in the shadow of temples dedicated to gods of wisdom and war, ordinary people were quietly revolutionizing how civilization fed itself. But revolutions, as the Greeks knew better than most, have a way of eating their own children. The very success of Greek street food culture would eventually contribute to its spectacular, messy, historically inevitable downfall. Because when you build a food system on speed, profit, and minimal oversight, certain unpleasant realities become unavoidable. Food poisoning, for instance, economic exploitation, adulteration of ingredients, price fixing, black market ingredients, and the slow, inexorable corruption of the very democratic ideals that made the whole system possible in the first place. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Right now, in our imaginary stroll through ancient Athens, the vendors are just setting up their stalls for the day. The charcoal is being lit, the oil is heating up, and the city is waking up hungry. The sun is climbing higher, casting sharp shadows between the columns and across the cobblestones. Street dogs are already gathering hopefully around the cooking areas, their noses twitching at familiar scents. Early customers are beginning to appear, rubbing sleep from their eyes and reaching for their coin purses. The day's drama is about to begin. Somewhere in the distance, a philosopher is probably preparing a lecture about the relationship between physical pleasure and spiritual enlightenment, blissfully unaware that his breakfast was prepared by a vendor who hasn't washed his hands since the last full moon. Such is the beautiful irony of civilization. The smoke is rising, the crowds are gathering, and fortunes are about to be made and lost over bowls of soup and chunks of bread. This is the story of how ancient Greece fed itself, and why that story ended with the kind of spectacular collapse that only happens when you combine human greed with inadequate sanitation. But for now, in this golden moment before everything goes sideways, let's just enjoy the aroma of sizzling onions and the cheerful chaos of a civilization that believed democracy and street food could coexist peacefully. Spoiler alert, they couldn't. The stage is set, the vendors are ready, and history is about to get deliciously, disgustingly complicated. Welcome to the rise and fall of ancient Greek fast food, where philosophy meets Greece and nobody emerges with clean hands. Take a deep breath of that smoky air because it's about to get much, much worse. But oh, what a ride it's going to be. In the beginning, there was bread. Simple, honest, life-sustaining bread baked in household ovens and community kilns. Eaten fresh with olive oil and perhaps a sprinkle of salt if you were feeling extravagant. This was food as sustenance, uncomplicated by commerce or ambition. But then came urbanization, and with it, the beautiful chaos that transforms simple needs into complex systems. As Greek city-states grew from scattered settlements into thriving metropolises, something fundamental shifted in how people lived, worked, and most importantly, ate. The problem was time, or rather, the lack of it. When you're a farmer, you eat when the work is done and the sun sets. When you're a craftsman in a bustling city, competing for customers and contracts, every minute spent preparing food is a minute not spent earning money. Enter the kapaloi, those entrepreneurial souls who recognized opportunity in the growing urban hunger. They started small, perhaps selling leftover bread from household baking, or offering simple prepared foods to neighbors who worked late at their shops. What began as neighborly convenience quickly evolved into something far more sophisticated. The first street food vendors weren't just selling food, they were selling time. They were offering busy urbanites the revolutionary concept that someone else could handle the tedious business of cooking, while they focused on more profitable pursuits. The Agora became the epicenter of this transformation. Originally designed as a space for political assembly and trading goods, it naturally attracted vendors selling refreshments to the crowds. A few olive vendors here, some bread sellers there, perhaps a wine merchant or two. But Greeks, being Greeks, couldn't leave well enough alone. If simple food was good, then elaborate food must be better. If feeding people was profitable, then feeding them more expensively must be more profitable. The logic was unassailable if you ignored the potential consequences. The breakthrough came with the invention of portable cooking equipment. Some forgotten genius realized that you could cook food on site, hot and fresh, rather than simply selling day-old leftovers. This was the ancient equivalent of the microwave oven, revolutionizing speed and convenience. Suddenly, vendors were offering hot soups, grilled meats, fried fish, and warm pastries. They could set up anywhere there was foot traffic and a source of fuel. The city became their kitchen, and every corner a potential restaurant. The variety was staggering. Vendors specialized in different types of bread: black bread for the poor, white bread for the wealthy, and every gradation in between. Some focused on legumes, offering lentil soup, chickpea fritters, and bean stews that could feed a working man for a few obol. Fish vendors created elaborate displays of their daily catch, though the freshness was often more theatrical than actual. Meat sellers offered everything from sausages to roasted organs to mysterious stews, where the identity of the protein was best left unexamined. Pastry vendors, the most artistic of the bunch, created confections that were equal parts food and sculpture. Honey cakes shaped like animals, cheese pastries twisted into intricate patterns, and sweetbreads that looked almost too beautiful to eat. Almost. The wine vendors operated in a category all their own, offering everything from barely fermented grape juice to throat-burning spirits that could strip paint off a trireme. They often doubled as informal tavern keepers, providing crude tables and benches where customers could linger over their meals. But it wasn't just about the food itself, it was about the experience. Street vendors became the unofficial news networks of ancient cities, spreading gossip, political rumors, and scandal along with their wares. Want to know what happened in the assembly yesterday? Ask your soup vendor. The social dynamics were fascinating. Wealthy citizens publicly disdained street food as beneath their dignity, insisting they preferred the refined cuisine prepared by their household slaves. But privately, many of them were regular customers, sometimes sending servants to make purchases to maintain plausible deniability. Working-class Athenians, meanwhile, embraced street food culture with enthusiasm. For them, it represented upward mobility in miniature, the ability to purchase prepared food rather than subsist on whatever could be scraped together at home. It was a small luxury that made urban life bearable. The vendors themselves developed a complex social hierarchy. At the top were the established operators with prime locations and loyal customer bases. These were the aristocrats of street food, often owning multiple stalls and employing teams of assistants. Below them were the seasonal vendors, who appeared during festivals and special events, offering specialized foods that capitalized on temporary demand. They lived feast or famine existences, making fortunes during religious celebrations and barely surviving during quiet periods. At the bottom were the desperate vendors, often refugees, former slaves, or citizens who had fallen on hard times. They sold whatever they could manage to prepare, often of questionable quality, to customers who had few other options. The competition was fierce and sometimes violent. Vendors guarded their recipes like state secrets and their prime locations like territorial animals. Disputes over customer poaching or ingredient sourcing could escalate into full-scale brawls that required intervention by city magistrates. Innovation flourished in this competitive environment. Vendors experimented with new cooking techniques, exotic spices, and unusual ingredient combinations. They developed the ancient equivalent of brand loyalty by creating signature dishes that customers would seek out specifically. The preservation problem drove tremendous creativity. Without refrigeration, vendors had to constantly innovate ways to keep food safe and appealing in Mediterranean heat. They developed smoking techniques, pickling methods, and spice combinations that could mask the taste of borderline spoilage. Seasoning became an art form. Vendors competed to create the most complex and appealing flavor profiles, often importing expensive spices from distant lands, silphium, cinnamon, black pepper, and other exotic seasonings transformed simple ingredients into culinary adventures. The economic impact was enormous. Street food vendors created entire supply chains, supporting farmers, fishermen, spice merchants, pottery makers, and fuel suppliers. They provided employment for thousands of people and generated significant tax revenue for city governments. Politicians quickly recognized the importance of keeping food vendors happy and customers fed. Nothing threatened civil order like hungry citizens, and nothing maintained social stability like readily available, affordable food. Street vendors became essential infrastructure. The cultural influence was equally significant. Street food vendors popularized ingredients and cooking techniques that eventually filtered up to wealthy households. They served as laboratories for culinary innovation, testing new ideas on adventurous customers before they became mainstream. Religious festivals became major events for food vendors who developed specialized offerings for different celebrations. Temple vendors created foods associated with specific gods, while procession vendors followed religious parades, feeding both participants and spectators. The military applications were revolutionary. Armies marching to war were followed by mobile vendors who could provide hot meals and medical supplies. These camp followers became essential support personnel, often determining the success or failure of military campaigns. International trade flourished as vendors sought exotic ingredients to distinguish their offerings. Athenian street food began incorporating flavors from across the Mediterranean, creating fusion cuisine centuries before anyone had a name for it. The technology continued to evolve. Vendors developed increasingly sophisticated portable ovens, improved preservation techniques, and more efficient service methods. They were the research and development arm of ancient cuisine. Quality control, however, remained largely theoretical. While successful vendors had incentives to maintain standards, there were few regulations and little oversight. Customers learned to judge vendors by reputation, repeat business, and the visible health of other patrons. The social commentary began early. Playwrights included food vendors as comic characters in their productions, while philosophers debated whether street food represented democratic accessibility or dangerous indulgence. The vendors themselves became symbols of broader cultural tensions. Women played crucial but often invisible roles in street food culture. While many vendors were men, women frequently handled food preparation, ingredient sourcing, and customer service. Some operated their own stalls, though they often faced additional legal and social obstacles. Children grew up immersed in street food culture, learning business skills while helping their families operate vendors' stalls. Many future merchants, craftsmen, and even politicians got their start in the chaotic world of ancient food service. The geographical spread was remarkable. What began in Athens quickly spread to other Greek cities, each developing its own specialties and variations. Corinthian vendors became famous for their seafood, while Spartan vendors offered whatever could be prepared with minimal effort and maximum nutritional value. Colonial expansion carried Greek street food culture across the Mediterranean. Greek settlements from Sicily to the Black Sea developed local variants that incorporated indigenous ingredients while maintaining recognizable connections to homeland traditions. The seasonal rhythms were complex and crucial. Vendors had to navigate agricultural cycles, religious calendars, political events, and weather patterns. Success required understanding not just cooking, but economics, logistics, and social dynamics. By the height of the classical period, street food had become so integrated into Greek urban life that cities literally could not function without it. The vendors had created a parallel food distribution system that fed hundreds of thousands of people daily. The golden age seemed sustainable, even inevitable. Vendors prospered, customers were fed, governments collected taxes, and everyone seemed happy with the arrangement. Street food had become one of the great success stories of ancient entrepreneurship. But like all success stories in ancient Greece, this one contained the seeds of its own destruction. The very factors that made street food culture so successful, entrepreneurial freedom, minimal regulation, fierce competition, would eventually create conditions for spectacular failure. The signs were already visible to anyone who cared to look. Corners were being cut, quality was declining in some quarters, and the gap between successful vendors and struggling ones was widening. The system was becoming unstable. But for now, in this golden moment of sizzling onions and satisfied customers, everything seemed possible. The vendors had conquered hunger, mastered commerce, and created a new way of urban living. They were the kings of the ancient food world. They just didn't realize yet that empires built on grease and profit have a tendency to slip through your fingers when you least expect it. The first cracks in the gleaming facade of Greek street food culture appeared not as dramatic collapses, but as small, easily overlooked compromises. A vendor here using slightly older fish. A baker there watering down his dough with cheaper ingredients. Nothing alarming, nothing that would cause immediate concern. But those tiny fractures were symptoms of larger pressures building within the system. As competition intensified and profit margins tightened, vendors faced an impossible choice: maintain quality and risk bankruptcy, or cut corners and hope nobody noticed. Most chose survival. The root of the problem was success itself. As street food became more popular and profitable, it attracted attention from people whose primary expertise wasn't cooking, but making money. Investors began buying up successful vendors, treating food stalls like any other commodity to be optimized for maximum return. These new owners often had little understanding of food preparation, and even less interest in customer satisfaction beyond the minimum necessary to generate profit. They viewed vendors as interchangeable workers, and customers as sources of revenue to be maximized through any means necessary. The original vendors, those passionate entrepreneurs who had built the industry through skill and dedication, found themselves either bought out or undercut by operators who could afford to sell at loss-making prices until their competition disappeared. Quality control, which had always been informal and reputation-based, began to erode as the connection between vendor and customer became increasingly impersonal. When the person cooking your food had never met you and never expected to see you again, their incentive to ensure your satisfaction diminished considerably. Ingredient sourcing became a race to the bottom, where successful vendors had once prided themselves on securing the finest olive oil and freshest fish. New operators focused primarily on finding the cheapest suppliers, regardless of quality. The difference was usually invisible until after purchase. The preservation techniques that had been carefully developed over generations began to be abandoned in favor of faster, cheaper methods that prioritized shelf life over flavor or safety. Foods that had once been carefully smoked or pickled were now simply doused in salt or oil and hoped for the best. Adulteration became common. Expensive spices were stretched with cheaper alternatives. Wine was watered down. Olive oil was mixed with less expensive oils. Honey was diluted with whatever sweet substances could be found. The practice was profitable as long as customers couldn't immediately detect the difference. The seasonal rhythms that had once governed street food operations began to be ignored as vendors tried to maximize revenue year-round. Fish vendors sold preserved seafood when fresh wasn't available. Fruit vendors offered imported or stored produce, regardless of local harvest seasons. The natural cycle of quality was broken. Labor conditions deteriorated as owners sought to minimize costs. Vendors who had once been skilled craftsmen became low-wage workers with minimal training. Food preparation that had required years of experience to master was reduced to following simple instructions designed to eliminate the need for expertise. The social contract between vendors and customers began to fray. Where street food had once been a community institution where vendors knew their regular customers and took pride in serving their neighborhoods, it increasingly became a purely transactional relationship focused on speed and volume. Health problems began to surface, though slowly and in ways that were difficult to trace directly to specific vendors. Stomach ailments increased. Food poisoning, while not unknown in ancient times, became more frequent and severe. The connection between declining food quality and public health was obvious to some, invisible to others. City officials, initially pleased with the tax revenue generated by thriving food vendors, began to notice concerning trends. Complaints increased, medical costs rose. The street food industry that had once been a source of civic pride was becoming a source of civic problems. But the economic momentum was difficult to reverse. Too many people depended on the street food industry for their livelihoods. Too many investors had committed capital to the system. Too many customers relied on cheap, convenient food to change their habits easily. Price competition became vicious as vendors struggled to maintain market share while dealing with rising costs and declining margins. The price wars benefited customers in the short term, but devastated the economic foundation of the industry. Established vendors with loyal customer bases found themselves unable to compete with newcomers who could sell at artificially low prices. Many of the original entrepreneurs who had built the industry were forced out of business by operators who treated food service as a purely financial exercise. The geographic expansion that had once been a source of strength became a source of vulnerability. Street food vendors in distant colonies were separated from traditional suppliers and quality control systems. Local adaptation sometimes resulted in dangerous experimentation with unfamiliar ingredients. Seasonal vendors, who had once provided variety and innovation, began to disappear as year-round operators squeezed them out of prime locations and undercut their prices. The festivals and celebrations that had been highlights of the street food calendar became dominated by generic offerings. The supply chains that supported street food vendors became increasingly complex and unreliable. As operators sought cheaper ingredients from more distant sources, the quality and consistency of raw materials became unpredictable. Vendors often didn't know what they were serving until it was too late. Political pressures mounted as the social costs of declining food quality became apparent. Wealthy citizens, who had always disdained street food publicly, began to lobby for regulations that would restrict vendor operations in their neighborhoods. The poor, who depended on cheap street food, found themselves caught in the middle. Military campaigns began to suffer as the camp followers who had once provided reliable support became less dependable. Soldiers reported increased illness from vendor-supplied food, and commanders began to question whether traditional foraging might be safer than purchasing from commercial suppliers. Religious authorities started to express concern about the spiritual implications of food preparation that prioritized profit over purity. Temple vendors, who had once been held to higher standards, were increasingly indistinguishable from their secular counterparts in terms of quality and conduct. The technological innovations that had driven early success began to stagnate as operators focused on cost-cutting rather than improvement. The sophisticated preservation techniques and cooking equipment that had made Greek street food superior to alternatives were abandoned in favor of simpler, cheaper methods. Training and apprenticeship systems collapsed as the industry moved away from skilled craftwork toward unskilled labor. The knowledge and techniques that had been passed down through generations of vendors began to disappear as experienced practitioners were replaced by inexperienced workers. International reputations suffered as foreign visitors to Greek cities encountered declining food quality and increasing health risks. The street food culture that had once been a source of cultural pride became an embarrassment that officials tried to hide from important guests. The diplomatic implications became serious as foreign ambassadors and trade delegations began reporting back to their home governments about the dangerous conditions in Greek vendor areas. What had once been a selling point for Greek culture became a liability that damaged international relationships and trade opportunities. Visiting merchants who had once looked forward to experiencing authentic Greek street food began to pack their own provisions or seek accommodation that included meals, rather than risk exposure to vendor operations. The economic impact of this shift in visitor behavior rippled through the hospitality industry and reduced the foreign currency that street food had once helped attract. Cultural exchange programs that had once included culinary experiences began to omit street food entirely, depriving Greek vendors of opportunities to showcase their traditions to international audiences and learn from foreign food cultures. The isolation that resulted from this cutoff accelerated the industry's decline by reducing innovation and competition. Foreign students who had once studied Greek cooking techniques began to seek training elsewhere, damaging Greece's reputation as a center of culinary learning and reducing the international demand for Greek-trained food professionals. The brain drain that resulted weakened the industry's intellectual foundation. Trade relationships suffered as foreign suppliers became reluctant to sell premium ingredients to Greek vendors who had developed reputations for adulterating and misusing high-quality products. The supply chain degradation that resulted made it even more difficult for honest vendors to maintain standards. International festivals and competitions that had once featured Greek street food began to exclude or downgrade Greek participation, reducing the exposure and prestige that had helped maintain industry standards. The loss of these competitive incentives removed important motivation for excellence and innovation. Tourism revenue declined, as word spread about the risks associated with street food consumption in Greek cities. Travelers who had once planned extended stays to explore local food culture began to limit their visits or avoid Greece entirely, creating economic losses that extended far beyond the vendor industry itself. Foreign investment in Greek food operations virtually disappeared as international business people concluded that the industry was too risky and too poorly regulated to justify capital commitments. The lack of outside investment reduced the resources available for upgrading equipment and improving standards. Scholarly exchange in culinary arts ceased as foreign academics began to view Greek food culture as a cautionary tale rather than a source of knowledge and inspiration. The intellectual isolation that resulted cut Greek vendors off from international developments in food safety and preparation techniques. International shipping companies began to avoid Greek ports when carrying food cargoes, fearing contamination from local handling practices and storage facilities. The maritime commerce that had once supported ingredient importation and food exportation was disrupted, further isolating Greek food culture from international influences. Foreign language accounts of Greek street food culture shifted from admiring descriptions to warning narratives, creating lasting damage to Greece's cultural reputation that persisted long after the vendor industry had collapsed. These negative portrayals became embedded in international literature and travel writing. Military alliances suffered as foreign armies became reluctant to campaign alongside Greek forces, who relied on vendor-supplied provisions. The reputation for unreliable food support made Greek military partnerships less attractive and reduced Greece's strategic value to potential allies. International law began to include provisions specifically addressing food safety in diplomatic contexts, with many treaties requiring host nations to guarantee safe food for visiting delegations. Greece's inability to provide such guarantees limited its diplomatic hosting opportunities and reduced its international influence. Trade route modifications diverted commercial traffic away from Greek cities, as merchants sought to avoid exposure to contaminated food supplies during their journeys. The economic isolation that resulted from these route changes damaged Greece's position as a Mediterranean commercial hub. Foreign religious missions that had once included shared meals as part of cultural exchange began to avoid food-related activities when visiting Greece, reducing the soft power that cultural diplomacy had once provided and limiting opportunities for international relationship building. Educational exchanges in practical arts, including cooking and food preparation, virtually ceased as foreign institutions concluded that Greek training programs no longer met international standards. The loss of these educational connections reduced Greece's influence on international culinary development. International standards organizations began to develop food safety protocols, specifically designed to prevent the kind of degradation that had occurred in Greek street food culture. Greece became a negative example, used to illustrate the importance of proper regulation and oversight. Foreign aid and technical assistance programs began to focus on helping Greece rebuild its food safety infrastructure, a humiliating reversal of the traditional relationship where Greece had been a source of knowledge and innovation rather than a recipient of remedial assistance. The psychological impact on Greek cultural identity was severe, as the nation watched its reputation for culinary excellence transform into international notoriety for food safety failures. The collective shame that resulted from this transformation affected national morale and self-perception in ways that extended far beyond the food industry. International artistic representations of Greek culture began to omit or satirize street food elements that had once been portrayed with respect and admiration. The cultural products that helped shape international perceptions of Greece shifted from celebration to mockery, creating lasting reputational damage. Yet perhaps, most tragically, the international isolation that resulted from the street food disaster reduced Greece's access to the knowledge, resources, and partnerships that might have helped address the underlying problems more effectively. The country that most needed international assistance found itself least able to obtain it. The signs of systemic failure were everywhere for those who chose to see them. The question was no longer whether the street food system would collapse, but when, how completely, and what would replace it. But even as the decline accelerated, the system maintained its facade of normalcy. Vendors still set up their stalls each morning, customers still purchased their meals, and money still changed hands. The appearance of functionality masked the reality of dysfunction. The golden age was ending, but it was ending slowly, like a pot that takes a long time to boil over, but makes an enormous mess when it finally does. Let's talk about the smell, not the appetizing aroma of grilled meat and fresh bread that had once drawn customers from across the agora, but the new smell that began to permeate vendor areas as standards collapsed and desperation set in. It was the smell of oil reused too many times, of fish that had seen better days, of ingredients that had been preserved through methods that would make modern health inspectors weep. The olive oil, once the golden foundation of Greek cuisine, became a substance of dubious origin and horrifying consistency. Vendors discovered they could stretch expensive oil by mixing it with cheaper alternatives, or by reusing the same oil for days, weeks, even months. The result was a dark, viscous liquid that bore little resemblance to the pure product their customers expected. Fish vendors developed ingenious methods for disguising the telltale signs of decomposition. Eyes that had clouded over were brightened with plant extracts. Flesh that had begun to turn was rubbed with spices to mask both the discoloration and the smell. Gills that had blackened were hidden under creative arrangements of seaweed and herbs. The preservation techniques became increasingly desperate and dangerous. When proper smoking wasn't economically feasible, vendors discovered that certain chemicals could create the appearance and some of the flavor of smoked food without the time and expense of actual smoking. The fact that these chemicals were typically used for tanning leather seemed irrelevant to profit-driven operators. Meat of questionable origin began appearing in vendor stalls. When beef was too expensive, vendors discovered that certain other animals could be prepared to resemble beef, especially when properly seasoned and cooked beyond recognition. Dogs, cats, and even rats found their way into stews and sausages, their true nature disguised by heavy spicing and creative presentation. The bread became a particular horror as bakers discovered numerous ways to adulterate flour without obviously changing the appearance of the final product. Chalk was mixed into white flour to increase volume. Sawdust was added to create texture. Various other substances, some of which weren't technically food, found their way into loaves that customers purchased, trusting in traditions that no longer existed. Wine vendors pioneered techniques that would be impressive if they weren't so appalling. Lead compounds were added to create sweetness and preserve what passed for wine. Other metals were used to adjust colour and flavour. The result was often a beverage that was technically alcoholic but bore no resemblance to actual fermented grape juice. The honey situation became particularly grotesque as vendors discovered that various tree saps and other plant extracts could be processed to resemble honey while costing a fraction of the real thing. The fact that some of these substitutes were mildly toxic seemed to be considered an acceptable trade-off for improved profit margins. Spice vendors developed an entire shadow industry around creating fake versions of expensive imported seasonings. What customers thought was black pepper might be ground charcoal mixed with local herbs. Cinnamon was often tree bark from whatever was locally available. Saffron, the most expensive spice of all, was counterfeited using everything from flower petals to dried animal parts. The cheese vendors discovered that the aging process that created valuable mature cheeses could be simulated using various treatments that produce similar textures and flavors in a fraction of the time. The fact that these accelerated aging techniques often involved substances that weren't remotely edible was apparently considered a minor detail. Vegetable vendors learned to disguise wilted and rotting produce through strategic trimming and creative display techniques. Mouldy portions were carefully carved away, and the remaining parts arranged to hide the damage. Vegetables that had begun to decompose were chopped and mixed into preparations where their condition would be less obvious. The soup vendors became masters of disguise, creating broths that could hide almost any combination of ingredients, regardless of quality or origin. A skilled soup vendor could take scraps that should have been thrown away days earlier and transform them into something that looked and smelled approximately like food. Sausage making became an exercise in creative protein sourcing, as vendors discovered that almost any organic matter could be ground, seasoned, and stuffed into casings to create products that were technically edible. The traditional recipes that had specified particular cuts of particular animals became more like general guidelines than actual requirements. The pastry vendors developed techniques for creating elaborate visual displays that concealed the reality of their ingredients. Beautiful honey cakes that looked like works of art were often made with flour that had been adulterated, oil that had been reused countless times, and honey that had never seen a bee. Preservation through salt became an exercise in chemical experimentation, as vendors discovered that various other white crystalline substances could be substituted for actual salt, often with interesting but not necessarily beneficial effects on both the food and the customers who consumed it. The fermentation processes that had traditionally created safe preserved foods were shortened and altered to save time and money, often resulting in products that were technically fermented but harbored bacterial populations that were decidedly unfriendly to human digestive systems. Storage became a nightmare as vendors crammed increasing quantities of food into spaces that were never designed for the purpose. Rats, insects, and other pests found paradises in vendor storage areas that were dark, warm, and filled with easily accessible food. The line between intentional and accidental protein sources became increasingly blurred. Water, the foundation of all food preparation, became a source of particular concern as vendors began using whatever sources were convenient rather than seeking clean supplies. River water, well water of questionable purity, and even collected rainwater that had run off roofs and through gutters found its way into food preparation. The cooking equipment that had once been carefully maintained and regularly cleaned became encrusted with layers of grease, food residue, and substances that defied identification. Cleaning was expensive and time-consuming. Cooking over dirty equipment was cheap and fast. Utensils were shared between different types of food preparation without cleaning, leading to cross-contamination that created flavor combinations that were unintentional and often unpleasant. A spoon used for fish soup in the morning might be used for honey cakes in the afternoon, with predictable results. The vendors themselves became walking health hazards, as personal hygiene standards collapsed, along with food safety standards. Hands that handled food also handled money, waste, and various other substances without the intervention of washing. The concept of food safety was becoming purely theoretical. The transformation of vendor appearance from respectable craftsmen to figures that resembled plague victims was gradual but inexorable. What had once been clean aprons and neat hair became stained garments and unkempt appearances that reflected the chaos of their working conditions. Customers learned to judge vendor safety by visual inspection, though the correlation between appearance and actual food quality was often unreliable. Skin conditions became endemic among food handlers as constant exposure to grease, smoke, and various chemicals created rashes, burns, and infections that made it painful to work, but economically impossible to stop. The visible signs of these conditions: scarred hands, irritated eyes, persistent coughs became warning signals that experienced customers learned to recognize. The tools of the trade began to reflect their users' degraded conditions. Knives that had once been carefully maintained became chipped and rusted. Cutting boards developed permanent stains and grooves that harbored bacteria. Cooking pots accumulated layers of residue that changed their capacity and altered the taste of everything prepared in them. Hair became a particular problem, as vendors working over open fires and steaming pots in hot weather found it increasingly difficult to maintain any semblance of grooming. The combination of grease, smoke, and sweat created matted, malodorous tangles that deposited particles into food during preparation. Hair coverings, when they existed at all, were often so filthy that they contributed to rather than prevented contamination. Dental hygiene among vendors deteriorated rapidly as the combination of poor nutrition, constant tasting of questionable food, and lack of resources for dental care created mouths that were both visually disturbing and actively dangerous to food safety. Vendors with rotting teeth and infected gums were breathing directly onto food during preparation and service. The clothing worn by vendors became a study in creative adaptation, as garments designed for normal wear were modified for cooking use without consideration for hygiene or safety. Sleeves that dragged through food, aprons that hadn't been washed in weeks, and shoes that tracked various substances from one preparation area to another became standard equipment. Body odor became so pervasive in vendor areas that it affected the taste of food through aromatic contamination. The combination of human perspiration, cooking smoke, and food residue created personal clouds of scent that customers learned to breathe through their mouths to avoid. Some vendors attempted to mask their odors with various oils and perfumes, creating even more complex and unpleasant aromatic combinations. Injuries became common as vendors working with sharp tools, hot surfaces, and dangerous equipment under increasing time pressure inevitably suffered cuts, burns, and other wounds. The lack of proper medical care meant that many of these injuries became infected, creating additional sources of contamination as vendors continued to work with open wounds. Sleep deprivation affected most vendors as the economic pressures that forced them to work longer hours combined with living conditions that made rest difficult. Exhausted vendors made more mistakes, exercised poorer judgment, and were more likely to cut corners in ways that compromised food safety. The visible signs of chronic fatigue became another warning signal for cautious customers. Malnutrition ironically affected many food vendors as their focus on selling rather than eating, combined with their reluctance to consume their own questionable products, led to dietary deficiencies that affected their health, appearance, and judgment. Vendors who spent their days surrounded by food often went hungry themselves. Substance abuse became common, as vendors sought relief from the physical and psychological stresses of their work through alcohol and other available substances. Intoxicated food handlers created obvious safety hazards, but the detection and prevention of such problems was nearly impossible in the chaotic vendor environment. Mental health deterioration was visible in the behavior of vendors who had lost pride in their work and hope for their futures. Erratic behavior, emotional outbursts, and obvious signs of psychological distress became common sights in vendor areas, creating additional unpredictability in food preparation and service. Family relationships within vendor households became strained as the demands of survival forced multiple generations to work in unhealthy conditions, while knowing they were contributing to a system that was harming their community. Children working alongside parents developed cynical attitudes toward honesty and quality that would affect their entire lives. Social isolation increased as vendors found themselves excluded from normal community relationships due to their association with dangerous food practices. The stigma attached to vendor work created a separate caste of people who were essential to urban survival but excluded from urban society. Economic desperation drove vendors to work, even when they were obviously ill, creating situations where people with communicable diseases continued to handle food because stopping work meant immediate economic catastrophe. The lack of any social safety net made it impossible for sick vendors to remove themselves from food preparation. Pregnancy and childbirth among vendor families created particular hazards as women continued to work in toxic environments because they had no alternatives. The exposure of pregnant women and nursing mothers to the chemicals, smoke, and stress of vendor work affected not just their own health, but that of their children. Aging vendors, who had once been skilled craftsmen, became pitiful figures clinging to work. They could no longer perform safely because they had no retirement options. The sight of elderly people struggling to lift heavy pots or stand over cooking fires for hours created emotional distress for customers who remembered better times. Child labor became essential to vendor operations as families struggled to generate enough income to survive. Children as young as 5 or 6 were pressed into service handling food, tending fires, and serving customers, often without adequate supervision or training in basic safety practices. Education ceased entirely for vendor families, as economic survival required every family member to contribute to work rather than pursuing learning opportunities. The intellectual development that might have provided paths out of vendor work was sacrificed to immediate economic necessities. Healthcare became inaccessible to most vendor families, as medical practitioners avoided vendor areas, and vendors couldn't afford treatment even when it was available. The accumulation of untreated health problems created a population that was visibly deteriorating while continuing to handle food for public consumption. Housing conditions for vendor families reflected their economic circumstances and social isolation. Overcrowded, poorly maintained living spaces located in the least desirable areas of cities created additional health problems that vendors carried with them to their work sites. Transportation between living areas and work sites often involved walking through contaminated streets and vendor districts, creating additional exposure to toxic conditions that accumulated throughout vendors' daily lives. The environmental hazards were inescapable for people whose economic survival depended on working in the most contaminated areas. Legal vulnerability increased as vendors operating outside regulatory compliance lived in constant fear of prosecution, while being unable to afford legal representation or remediation of their violations. The stress of potential legal consequences added psychological pressure to already overwhelming practical difficulties. Religious and social ceremonies became impossible for vendor families, as their association with food contamination made them unwelcome at community celebrations, and their economic circumstances made participation in religious obligations financially impossible. The spiritual isolation that resulted from this exclusion added emotional suffering to physical hardship. Cultural transmission ceased as vendor families became unable to participate in the educational and social activities that preserve traditions and knowledge for future generations. The children growing up in vendor families were cut off from their cultural heritage and unable to develop alternative identities. The cumulative effect of all these personal degradations was to create a population of people who were essential to urban survival, but had been systematically dehumanized by the conditions of their work. The vendors who fed Greek cities had become casualties of the system they served, living embodiments of the costs of prioritizing economic efficiency over human dignity. Customer serving areas became landscapes of spilled food, discarded scraps, and surfaces that hadn't been cleaned since their installation. Tables and benches developed sticky coatings that trapped additional debris and provided ideal breeding grounds for various forms of microscopic life. The waste disposal systems that had been adequate for small-scale operations proved completely inadequate for the volume of garbage generated by larger vendor operations. Food scraps, cooking waste, and customer refuse accumulated in growing piles that attracted increasingly bold populations of scavengers. Pest control became impossible as the environmental conditions created by declining vendor operations provided ideal habitats for rats, mice, insects, and various other creatures that thrived in warm, food-rich environments with minimal human interference. The seasonal cycles that had once naturally cleaned and refreshed vendor areas through winter closures and spring cleanings were abandoned as operators tried to maintain year-round revenue, resulting in continuous accumulation of filth and degradation of conditions. Quality control equipment, to the extent that it ever existed, was abandoned as unnecessary expense. Vendors no longer checked the freshness of their ingredients, the cleanliness of their equipment, or the safety of their preparation methods. Speed and quantity became the only measures of success. The economic pressures that drove these changes created a feedback loop where declining standards led to lower prices, which led to more customers, which led to higher volume, which led to further pressure to cut costs, which led to even lower standards. Disease vectors multiplied as the combination of poor food quality, unsanitary preparation conditions, and high customer volume created ideal conditions for transmitting various forms of illness between vendors and customers. The vendor areas became epidemiological nightmares. The social customs that had once governed vendor behavior, the informal rules about quality, service, and community responsibility disappeared as survival became the only consideration. The communal aspects of food vending were replaced by purely predatory commercial relationships. Documentation of these conditions was rare because literacy was limited and because those who could write were often either benefiting from the system or afraid to criticize it. The evidence of the decline exists primarily in medical records, legal complaints, and the occasional horrified account from foreign visitors. The government officials who might have intervened were often either corrupt, overwhelmed, or simply unaware of the scope of the problem. The regulatory systems that existed were designed for a simpler time and couldn't cope with the complexity and scale of the industrial food production that was emerging. The environmental damage caused by declining vendor operations began to affect entire neighborhoods as waste disposal systems collapsed and contamination spread beyond the immediate vendor areas. Wells became polluted, streets became impassable due to accumulated filth, and the very air became thick with smoke and odors that made normal life difficult. The cooking fires that had once been carefully tended and properly ventilated became smoke-belching infernos as vendors burned whatever fuel they could afford, regardless of what toxic fumes it might produce. Wood was expensive. Garbage was free. The result was a perpetual haze that hung over vendor districts like a malevolent fog, carrying the scent of burning refuse mixed with cooking food in combinations that defied description. The ash and soot from these fires settled on everything, creating a grimy coating that turned white marble grey and made fresh food look dirty before customers even purchased it. The accumulated particulates created respiratory problems for anyone who spent time in vendor areas, though the economic necessities that drove people to work and shop there made avoiding exposure impossible for most. Water sources became contaminated, not just from direct pollution, but from the runoff that carried grease, food particles, and various other substances from vendor areas into the broader urban water supply. The fountains and wells that had once provided clean drinking water began to taste of whatever had been cooked, spilled, or disposed of in the vendor districts. The drainage systems that had been designed for rainwater and human waste proved completely inadequate for the volume and variety of liquids that vendor operations produced. Cooking oil, wine, various sauces, and cleaning water combined to create slicks and clogs that made streets impassable during rainy weather and created permanent puddles that bred mosquitoes and other disease vectors. Soil contamination spread outward from vendor areas as the accumulated waste of years soaked into the ground, creating dead zones where nothing would grow, and permanent odours that couldn't be eliminated even after vendor operations ceased. The earth itself became poisoned, requiring costly remediation that cash-strapped city governments couldn't afford. The structural damage to buildings in vendor areas accelerated as the constant exposure to grease, smoke, and various chemicals ate away at stone, wood, and metal. Facades crumbled, roofs leaked, and foundations shifted as the corrosive environment created by food operations literally dissolved the urban infrastructure. Vermin populations exploded as the abundance of food scraps, garbage, and shelter created ideal breeding conditions for rats, mice, insects, and various other creatures that thrived in the chaos. These populations became so large and aggressive that they began to pose direct threats to human safety, not just as disease carriers, but as competitors for food resources. The noise pollution created by vendor operations intensified as competition forced operators to use increasingly aggressive methods to attract customers. Shouting vendors, clanging cookware, sizzling fires, and the general cacophony of commercial activity combined to create sound levels that made normal conversation difficult and sleep nearly impossible in nearby residential areas. The visual pollution was equally overwhelming as vendors covered every available surface with signs, advertisements, cooking equipment, and food displays. The aesthetic that had once characterized Greek urban spaces, clean lines, harmonious proportions, visual clarity, was buried under a chaotic jumble of commercial messaging and functional equipment. The thermal pollution from cooking fires created microclimates around vendor areas that were significantly hotter than surrounding neighborhoods. These heat islands affected local weather patterns, created uncomfortable living conditions, and contributed to the rapid spoilage of any food that wasn't immediately consumed. The chemical contamination from various substances used in food preparation and preservation began to accumulate in soil and water to levels that affected plant growth, animal health, and human well-being. Lead from wine additives, various preservatives, and cleaning compounds created toxic environments that persisted long after the vendors who created them had disappeared. The biological contamination was perhaps most serious of all, as the bacterial and viral ecosystems that developed in vendor areas became reservoirs of disease that could spread throughout urban populations. The unsanitary conditions created perfect breeding grounds for pathogens that found their way into food, water, and air. Storage areas became archaeological sites of accumulated filth, with layers of spilled food, grease, and waste building up over months and years to create substrates that supported complex ecosystems of decomposition. These areas became so contaminated that they had to be completely excavated and rebuilt, rather than simply cleaned. The packaging materials used by vendors, mostly organic substances like leaves, animal skins, and crude pottery, contributed to waste streams that the urban infrastructure couldn't handle. Unlike modern packaging designed for disposal, ancient food containers often contained residual food that attracted pests and accelerated decomposition. Equipment maintenance became impossible, as the corrosive environment and lack of resources prevented proper care of cooking implements, serving vessels, and storage containers. Metal rusted, pottery cracked, and wooden implements rotted. creating safety hazards and contributing to contamination. The transportation of ingredients to vendor areas created additional pollution as carts, animals, and human carriers tracked mud, waste, and various other substances through city streets. The supply chains that fed vendor operations became vectors for spreading contamination throughout urban areas. Cleaning supplies, to the extent they existed, were often more dangerous than the dirt they were supposed to remove. The caustic substances available for cleaning could cause chemical burns, toxic fumes, and environmental damage that outlasted any benefits they might have provided. The competitive pressures that drove vendors to maximize their use of available space led to overcrowding that made proper sanitation impossible, even for operators who wanted to maintain standards. When every square foot had to generate revenue, there was no room for waste disposal, cleaning, or basic hygiene. The seasonal variations that had once provided natural cleaning cycles were disrupted as year-round operations prevented the natural die-off of pest populations and bacterial communities that had traditionally occurred during winter months when vendor activity decreased. Waste heat from cooking operations, when multiplied across hundreds of vendors operating in close proximity, created temperature conditions that accelerated spoilage, increased bacterial growth, and made working conditions nearly unbearable during summer months. The cumulative effect of all these environmental problems was to create vendor districts that were literally toxic to human life, yet economically essential to urban survival. The contradiction between necessity and safety became one of the defining characteristics of late-period Greek street food culture. Emergency response became impossible as the chaotic conditions in vendor areas made it difficult for authorities to access problem situations. When fires broke out, injuries occurred, or other emergencies developed, the physical environment often prevented effective intervention. The long-term environmental legacy of degraded vendor operations persisted for generations after the industry collapsed, creating permanent dead zones in ancient cities that required extensive remediation before they could be safely used for other purposes. The cost of cleaning up after street food vendors often exceeded the total economic value the industry had ever generated. Yet somehow, life continued in these environmental disaster zones. People adapted to conditions that would be considered uninhabitable by modern standards, developing tolerance for pollution levels that would trigger immediate evacuation today. The human capacity for adaptation, while admirable, also enabled the continuation of practices that should have been stopped immediately. The environmental damage became so normalized that many people stopped noticing it, accepting toxic conditions as simply part of urban life. This psychological adaptation prevented the kind of public outcry that might have forced earlier intervention and allowed the degradation to continue until it reached truly catastrophic levels. International observers who visited Greek cities during this period left accounts that described vendor districts as resembling war zones or natural disaster areas, yet noted that local residents seemed to accept these conditions as normal. The disconnect between external perception and internal acceptance highlighted how gradually environmental degradation could progress without triggering corrective action. The economic calculations that justified continuing vendor operations despite their environmental costs were based on short-term thinking that ignored the long-term cleanup expenses and health costs that would eventually have to be paid. The true cost of cheap street food was deferred rather than eliminated, creating debt that future generations would have to pay. Scientific understanding of environmental cause and effect was limited in ancient times, but the observable connections between vendor operations and environmental degradation were obvious to anyone who cared to look. The failure to act on this knowledge represented a triumph of economic necessity over environmental wisdom that would be repeated throughout human history. The most tragic aspect of the street food collapse wasn't the physical degradation or even the health consequences, but the psychological transformation that occurred in everyone involved. Vendors who had once taken pride in their craft became desperate survivors, willing to compromise any standard to avoid starvation. Customers, who had once trusted their neighborhood food providers, became suspicious of every meal, yet remained dependent on a system they knew was failing them. The vendors themselves underwent the most profound psychological changes. Many had begun their careers as skilled craftsmen, passionate about food, and committed to serving their communities. The economic pressures that forced them to abandon their standards created a form of moral injury that went far deeper than financial hardship. They knew they were serving food that wasn't safe. They knew they were lying to customers about ingredients and preparation methods. They knew they were contributing to a system that was harming the very people they had once been proud to feed. But they also knew that stopping meant economic ruin for themselves and their families. The cognitive dissonance created by this situation was unbearable for many vendors. Some simply denied the reality of what they were doing, convincing themselves that their corner cutting wasn't really dangerous or that their customers didn't really care about quality anyway. Self-deception became a survival skill. Others developed a bitter cynicism that allowed them to continue operating by deciding that everyone was corrupt, everyone was cheating, and that maintaining any standards would be pointless self-sacrifice. If the system was broken, they reasoned, they might as well benefit from the breakdown. The most tragic vendors were those who maintained awareness of what they had lost, while feeling powerless to change their circumstances. They continued to serve substandard food, while mourning the pride and satisfaction they had once taken in their work. They became ghosts of their former professional selves. Customer psychology became equally warped as people developed complex strategies for navigating a food system they couldn't trust but couldn't abandon. Some became obsessively cautious, inspecting every purchase with the intensity of a medical examiner, yet still occasionally succumbing to hunger and convenience. The mental calculations that customers had to perform before every food purchase became elaborate risk assessments that would have challenged professional statisticians. They learned to evaluate vendor appearance, crowd size, cooking methods, ingredient freshness, and dozens of other variables in seconds, knowing that a wrong decision could mean days of illness or worse. Paranoid behaviors became normalized as customers developed superstitions and rituals around food selection that resembled religious practices more than commercial transactions. Some would only buy from vendors during certain times of day. Others would refuse to purchase anything that hadn't been cooked in their presence, and many developed elaborate systems for determining which vendors were safe on any given day. The social dynamics of food purchasing changed dramatically as customers began to rely on informal networks of information sharing to track which vendors were currently causing problems and which might be temporarily safe. These whisper networks operated like underground intelligence services, with regular customers serving as unwitting food safety scouts for their communities. Class distinctions became more pronounced as wealthy customers developed strategies for avoiding risk that weren't available to the poor. They could afford to waste money on food they ultimately discarded, to purchase from multiple vendors to diversify risk, or to simply go hungry rather than accept questionable options. The poor had no such luxuries. Psychological adaptation to chronic food insecurity created a mindset where customers learned to ignore warning signs that would have alarmed their ancestors. People became inured to mild stomach discomfort, occasional nausea, and other symptoms that had once been recognized as signs of food poisoning, but were now simply accepted as normal consequences of urban eating. Children growing up during this period developed fundamentally different relationships with food than their parents had known. They learned to approach meals with suspicion rather than pleasure, to expect discomfort rather than satisfaction, and to view eating as a necessary risk rather than an enjoyable activity. Trust issues extended far beyond food purchases, as customers who had been repeatedly deceived by vendors began to question all commercial relationships. The erosion of confidence in food quality created broader skepticism about product claims, merchant honesty, and the reliability of any commercial transaction. Eating behaviors became ritualized as customers developed elaborate precautions designed to minimize the risks associated with vendor food. Some would only eat certain types of food at certain times. Others would consume only small quantities to limit potential damage. And many developed complex purging routines designed to eliminate contaminated food from their systems. Social eating declined dramatically as people became reluctant to share vendor food with friends or family members, knowing that offering contaminated food to loved ones would create guilt and potential liability. The communal aspects of eating that had been central to Greek culture were sacrificed to individual survival strategies. Medical self-treatment became common as customers learned to manage the digestive problems that had become routine consequences of vendor food consumption. Home remedies, folk cures, and amateur pharmaceutical preparations became essential survival tools for anyone who regularly ate street food. Economic behaviors shifted as customers began to factor potential medical costs into food purchasing decisions. The apparent savings from cheap vendor food had to be weighed against the expected costs of treating the illnesses that might result, creating complex calculations that made every meal a financial planning exercise. Memory and nostalgia became sources of psychological pain as older customers who remembered better times found themselves constantly comparing current experiences to past standards. The cognitive dissonance between memory and reality created ongoing emotional stress that affected mental health and social relationships. Cognitive biases developed as customers learned to rationalize continued participation in a food system they knew was dangerous. Optimism bias led people to believe they could avoid the risks that affected others, while availability bias caused them to minimize dangers they hadn't personally experienced recently. Stress eating paradoxically increased among people who were stressed about food safety, creating psychological loops where anxiety about vendor food led to increased consumption of the very food that was causing the anxiety. The lack of safe alternatives meant that stress relief often required accepting additional risk. Learned helplessness became common as customers concluded that all food options were equally dangerous and that attempting to make safe choices was pointless. This psychological state led to resignation and acceptance of whatever food was available, regardless of obvious quality problems. Survival guilt affected customers who had the resources to occasionally purchase safer food while watching their neighbors suffer from contaminated vendor meals. The arbitrary nature of who could afford safety and who couldn't created ethical conflicts that added psychological stress to practical concerns. Intergenerational conflict arose as older family members who remembered safer food tried to warn younger generations who had adapted to current conditions. The tension between caution based on historical experience and adaptation to current reality created family disputes that reflected broader social tensions. Decision fatigue became endemic as the constant need to evaluate food safety options exhausted customers' mental resources and led to increasingly poor choices. The cognitive load required for safe eating in an unsafe environment was more than most people could sustain consistently. Magical thinking increased as customers developed irrational beliefs about food safety that provided psychological comfort even when they offered no actual protection. These superstitions ranged from harmless rituals to dangerous misconceptions that actually increased risk. Social comparison became toxic as customers constantly evaluated their own food choices against those of others, leading to competitive behaviors around risk-taking that encouraged dangerous consumption patterns. The social pressure to appear unafraid of vendor food created peer pressure toward unsafe eating. Identity formation around food safety created subcultures of careful eaters and risk-takers that became social categories with their own norms, values, and behavioral expectations. These identity groups often conflicted with each other and created additional social tensions in communities already stressed by food insecurity. Emotional regulation became difficult as the daily stress of food safety decisions accumulated into chronic anxiety that affected sleep, relationships, and general mental health. The psychological toll of constantly evaluating survival risks was more than many people could bear without developing coping mechanisms that often involve denial or reckless behavior. Planning horizons shortened as customers learned to focus on immediate food needs rather than longer-term nutrition or health goals. The uncertainty about food safety made it impossible to develop eating strategies that extended beyond the next meal, creating a hand-to-mouth mentality that affected all aspects of life planning. Risk perception became distorted as customers who faced food safety dangers daily began to minimize risks that would have terrified people from safer environments. The normalization of danger created psychological adaptations that made it difficult to recognize when situations had become truly catastrophic. Communication patterns changed as customers developed elaborate codes and euphemisms for discussing food safety without directly criticizing vendors who might retaliate against honest feedback. The need for indirect communication about safety issues created linguistic adaptations that reflected the power imbalances between vendors and customers. These psychological adaptations, while necessary for survival in the short term, created long-term mental health problems that persisted even after the food safety crisis ended. The psychological scars left by chronic food insecurity affected not just individuals, but entire communities, creating cultural trauma that influenced social relationships and institutional trust for generations. Others adopted a fatalistic approach, deciding that food poisoning was simply an unavoidable risk of urban life and that worrying about it was pointless. They ate whatever was available and dealt with the consequences as they arose, developing a grim tolerance for digestive distress. The wealthy customers who had options began to withdraw entirely from street food culture, creating a class-based division where only the poor were forced to accept the risks associated with vendor food. This economic segregation of food safety created resentment and social tension that extended far beyond culinary concerns. Professional relationships between vendors and suppliers became poisoned by mutual suspicion and blame. Vendors accused suppliers of providing inferior ingredients. Suppliers accused vendors of mishandling good products. Trust, once the foundation of commercial relationships, became a luxury that few could afford. Family relationships within vendor households became strained, as different generations had different tolerance levels for the compromises required to stay in business. Older vendors often struggled with abandoning standards they had spent lifetimes developing, while younger family members were more willing to adapt to new economic realities. The psychological impact on children who worked in family vendor operations was particularly severe. They learned business practices and ethical standards that normalized deception and corner cutting as ordinary aspects of commercial life. The lessons they absorbed would influence their approach to all future endeavors. Community leaders found themselves in impossible positions, knowing that the street food system was causing harm, but also knowing that destroying it would create immediate economic catastrophe for thousands of families. The choice between short-term stability and long-term health seemed impossible to resolve. Religious authorities struggled with the spiritual implications of a food system that seemed to violate fundamental principles of honesty and care for community welfare. Some spoke out against vendor practices. Others chose to ignore problems they felt powerless to solve. Government officials developed a complex relationship with street food vendors, simultaneously depending on them for tax revenue and social stability, while knowing they were presiding over a system that was slowly poisoning their citizens. The political calculations required to maintain this balance created psychological stress for anyone with a functioning conscience. Military commanders who had once relied on vendor-supplied provisions began to question whether traditional foraging and hunting might be safer alternatives. The loss of reliable food support systems weakened military effectiveness and created additional strategic vulnerabilities. International observers who had once admired Greek food culture began to view it with suspicion and contempt. The psychological impact of this change in reputation affected Greek cultural identity and self-perception in ways that extended far beyond the food industry itself. The medical practitioners who treated vendor-related illnesses developed a complex form of professional frustration as they repeatedly treated conditions they knew were preventable but felt powerless to prevent. The ethical conflicts created by this situation led many to avoid vendor areas entirely. Philosophers and intellectuals found themselves confronting fundamental questions about the relationship between individual survival and community welfare. The street food crisis became a laboratory for examining moral theories under conditions of extreme practical pressure. The seasonal workers, who had once supplemented their income through festival vending, found themselves excluded from an industry they no longer recognized. Their psychological adjustment to permanent economic marginalization created social problems that rippled through entire communities. Young people who might have once aspired to become successful food vendors began to view the industry as a trap to be avoided rather than an opportunity to be pursued. The loss of this traditional path to economic advancement created generational conflicts and reduced social mobility. The customers who had once enjoyed street food as entertainment and social activity began to approach it with the grim determination of people fulfilling a necessary but unpleasant obligation. The pleasure had been drained from an activity that had once been a source of joy. Elderly customers who remembered better times became living reminders of what had been lost, their presence in vendor areas serving as constant reproach to current standards. Their complaints and comparisons created additional psychological pressure on vendors who were already struggling. The apprentice systems that had once transmitted knowledge and skills from experienced vendors to newcomers collapsed as experienced practitioners left the industry and newcomers learned only the degraded practices necessary for immediate survival. Foreign visitors who expected to experience the legendary Greek food culture found themselves confronting a reality that contradicted everything they had heard about Greek culinary traditions. Their disappointment and sometimes illness created international incidents that damaged diplomatic relationships. The cultural institutions that had grown up around street food, the festivals, traditions, and social customs began to wither as the underlying economic system could no longer support them. The loss of these community touchstones created a sense of cultural disintegration that affected social cohesion. Investment in innovation ceased as operators focused entirely on short-term survival rather than long-term improvement. The psychological shift from growth-oriented to survival-oriented thinking created a self-perpetuating cycle of decline that became increasingly difficult to reverse. The professional identities that vendors had built around their skills and knowledge became obsolete as the industry moved towards standardized low-skill operations. The psychological impact of this professional death was often more devastating than the associated economic losses. Hope, perhaps the most crucial psychological resource for maintaining civilized society, began to disappear from street food culture as everyone involved, vendors, customers, officials, and observers, began to assume that decline was inevitable and improvement was impossible. The loss of hope made collaborative solutions unthinkable and individual survival strategies dominant. The end, when it finally came, wasn't a dramatic collapse, but rather a slow fade into irrelevance. Like a patient dying of a long illness, where everyone can see the outcome, but nobody can pinpoint the exact moment when death occurs. The street food industry didn't die with a bang. It simply stopped being worth the risk. The final blow came during what historians would later call the Great Poisoning of 418 BCE, though like most catastrophes, it was less an event than a culmination. A particularly virulent outbreak of food-related illness swept through Athens during the festival of Dionysus, when vendor activity was at its peak and customers were most trusting. The illness struck with devastating efficiency, affecting not just the poor, who had no choice but to eat vendor food, but also wealthy citizens who had been caught up in festival excitement and temporarily abandoned their usual caution. When prominent citizens began dying from street food consumption, the political calculations that had protected the industry evaporated overnight. The government response was swift and brutal. Vendor licenses were suspended, operations were shuttered, and many operators were prosecuted for what amounted to negligent homicide. The legal framework that had enabled street food commerce was dismantled in a matter of weeks, destroying an industry that had taken generations to build. But the economic damage was already irreversible. The supply chains that supported vendor operations collapsed as farmers, fishermen, and other producers found their primary customers bankrupt or in prison. The unemployment created by the industry's destruction rippled through the entire economy, creating secondary crises that lasted for years. The social fabric that had been built around street food culture simply disintegrated. The community gathering places, the informal information networks, the neighborhood traditions, all of it disappeared when the vendors who had served as focal points for these activities were no longer present. Many vendors attempted to continue operating illegally, but the customer base had been so thoroughly traumatized by the poisoning incident that even the desperate were reluctant to purchase vendor food. The industry that had once been essential to urban life became a pariah that most people actively avoided. The international reputation damage was complete and lasting. Foreign visitors who had once come to Athens partly to experience the famous street food culture now carried warnings back to their home cities about the dangers of Greek vendor operations. The cultural export that had once enhanced Greece's soft power became a liability. The economic alternatives that emerged to replace street food were either inadequate or unaffordable for most of the population that had depended on vendor operations. Home cooking required time and resources that working people didn't have. Restaurant dining was priced beyond the reach of ordinary citizens. The food distribution system simply couldn't adapt quickly enough to serve the masses. Malnutrition increased as people who had once reliably obtained cheap, if questionable, prepared food found themselves unable to afford adequate nutrition through other means. The health crisis caused by bad vendor food was replaced by a different health crisis caused by insufficient food, but the net result was continued suffering. The political ramifications were severe, as the government officials who had presided over the street food disaster found themselves blamed for both the original problems and the heavy-handed solutions. Several political careers ended, and the public trust in regulatory systems was severely damaged. The military implications became apparent during the next major campaign, when armies found themselves without the mobile food support systems that had become integral to Greek warfare. Soldiers were forced to return to traditional foraging and hunting, significantly reducing their mobility and effectiveness. The technological knowledge that had been developed over generations of vendor operations was lost, as experienced practitioners died, fled, or simply stopped passing on their skills. Preservation techniques, cooking methods, and equipment designs that had represented centuries of innovation disappeared within a few years. The social mobility that street food vending had once provided was eliminated, removing one of the few paths by which ambitious individuals from poor backgrounds could build economic independence. The loss of this opportunity contributed to increasing social stratification and reduced economic dynamism. The urban planning that had evolved around vendor operations became obsolete overnight. Market spaces, cooking facilities, and service areas that had been designed for street food operations stood empty, creating architectural monuments to a failed experiment in mass food distribution. The generational transfer of knowledge and skills that had sustained the industry was completely severed. Children who had been learning the trade alongside their families found themselves with expertise in an industry that no longer existed, while older practitioners watched their life's work become not just worthless, but actively harmful. The cultural identity that had been built around Greek food excellence began to shift toward other areas as street food, once a source of pride, became something to be forgotten or denied. The collective amnesia that developed around the industry's golden age was almost as complete as its physical destruction. The economic infrastructure that had supported vendor operations, the supply networks, distribution systems, and financial arrangements collapsed so completely that rebuilding would have required starting from scratch. The institutional knowledge needed for effective food commerce was lost, along with the physical assets. Some regions attempted to revive street food culture under stricter regulatory frameworks, but the customer trust that had been destroyed couldn't be rebuilt through government oversight alone. People who had learned to fear vendor food continued to avoid it, even when official assurances promised safety. The international spread of Greek food culture, which had once carried vendor traditions across the Mediterranean, reversed as colonial settlements abandoned Greek food practices in favor of local alternatives that seemed safer and more reliable. The seasonal rhythms that had once structured urban life around vendor operations were replaced by other patterns that made street food irrelevant, even if it had been safe. The social and economic cycles that had sustained the industry were broken and couldn't be reconstructed. Investment capital that might have been used to rebuild the industry on a sounder foundation was redirected toward other sectors that seemed more reliable and less likely to result in criminal prosecution. The financial resources needed for recovery weren't available when recovery became theoretically possible. The legal precedents established during the industry's destruction created lasting barriers to any form of commercial food preparation that resembled traditional vendor operations. The regulatory environment became so hostile that innovation in food service was effectively prohibited for generations. The court cases that emerged from the Great Poisoning created a body of law that fundamentally redefined the relationship between food sellers and buyers in ways that made traditional vendor operations legally impossible. Liability standards that had once been based on obvious negligence were extended to include any failure to meet safety standards that couldn't be consistently verified. Criminal penalties for food-related injuries became so severe that potential vendors couldn't afford the legal insurance necessary to operate, even if they wanted to maintain high standards. The legal costs of compliance exceeded the potential profits from food sales, making the entire business model economically impossible. Civil liability standards created situations where vendors could be held responsible for customer illnesses, even when the connection between specific foods and specific symptoms couldn't be definitively proven. The burden of proof shifted from customers proving vendor negligence to vendors proving their innocence, an impossible standard for small operators. Licensing requirements became so complex and expensive that they effectively excluded anyone without substantial capital and legal expertise from entering the food service industry. The regulatory framework that emerged was designed for large, well-funded operations and made small-scale entrepreneurship impossible. Inspection standards required equipment, facilities, and procedures that were far beyond the means of traditional vendors. The gap between regulatory requirements and economic reality made legal compliance impossible for the very people who had once formed the backbone of the industry. Record-keeping requirements mandated documentation standards that required literacy and administrative skills that most traditional vendors had never needed and couldn't afford to develop. The bureaucratic burden of legal compliance became a barrier to entry that excluded most of the people who had historically operated food businesses. Professional training requirements created artificial scarcities by requiring formal education for activities that had traditionally been learned through apprenticeship and experience. The institutionalization of food preparation knowledge made it inaccessible to people who couldn't afford formal training programs. Insurance requirements made it financially impossible for small operators to enter the food service business, while also making it difficult for existing operators to continue. The risk management systems that emerged were designed for large operations and priced small vendors out of the market. Import restrictions on ingredients that had been associated with adulteration created supply chain disruptions that made it difficult, even for honest vendors, to obtain the materials they needed for food preparation. The regulatory response to fraud created barriers for legitimate operators, as well as fraudulent ones. Export prohibitions damaged the international trade relationships that had once supported premium ingredient sourcing, making it more difficult for any Greek food operators to access the high-quality materials needed for safe food preparation. The international isolation created by regulatory responses had unintended consequences for industry recovery. Zoning restrictions segregated food preparation activities into areas that were often unsuitable for the purpose, creating additional costs and logistical challenges that made food service less economically viable. The physical separation of food operations from customer populations increased costs while reducing convenience. Employment law changes designed to protect food service workers created labour costs that small vendors couldn't afford, while also creating bureaucratic requirements that made it difficult to maintain the family-based operations that had traditionally sustained the industry. Tax policy changes imposed additional burdens on food service operations in attempts to fund regulatory oversight and victim compensation programs. The increased tax burden made marginal operations unprofitable and created additional barriers to industry recovery. Enforcement mechanisms became so aggressive that they created a climate of fear that discouraged experimentation and innovation. The punitive approach to regulatory compliance made potential vendors afraid to attempt food service operations, even when they were confident in their abilities and intentions. Appeals processes became so complex and expensive that small operators who were accused of violations couldn't afford to defend themselves, creating situations where regulatory decisions became final regardless of their accuracy or fairness. The legal system became biased against small operators who lacked resources for adequate representation. Evidence standards in food safety cases became so loose that vendors could be convicted based on circumstantial evidence and statistical correlations rather than direct proof of specific violations. The erosion of due process protections made it dangerous to operate food businesses, even when following all known safety procedures. Sentencing guidelines for food safety violations became so severe that they served as effective deterrents to anyone considering entering the food service industry. The risk of criminal penalties for unintended consequences made food service operations too dangerous for risk-averse individuals. Professional licensing boards gained authority over food service operations that extended far beyond their expertise or jurisdiction, creating regulatory redundancies and contradictions that made compliance impossible. The multiplication of regulatory authorities created situations where satisfying one requirement violated another. International legal cooperation in food safety enforcement created situations where Greek vendors could face prosecution in foreign jurisdictions for violations that occurred in Greece, extending legal liability across borders and making international food trade extremely risky. Precedent-setting decisions in food safety cases created legal standards that were retroactively applied to past operations, making it possible for vendors to be prosecuted for activities that had been legal when they occurred. The retrospective application of new standards violated traditional legal principles and created additional uncertainty. Class action lawsuit procedures made it possible for large groups of customers to sue vendors collectively, creating potential liabilities that exceeded the total value of vendor operations by orders of magnitude. The mathematical impossibility of satisfying these judgments made food service operations effectively uninsurable. Archaeological evidence suggests that the physical infrastructure of street food operations was systematically destroyed rather than simply abandoned, indicating a deliberate effort to ensure that the industry couldn't be easily revived. The civilization that had created street food culture made a conscious decision to erase it from existence. The final irony was that many of the factors that had made street food successful entrepreneurial innovation, competitive markets, minimal regulation, were exactly the factors that made its corruption inevitable. The system contained the seeds of its own destruction from the moment it achieved success. By 400 BCE, street food vending in Greece had become a historical curiosity rather than a living tradition. The vendors who remained were few, furtive and served only the most desperate customers who had no other options. The golden age was not just over, it had been so thoroughly repudiated that it might never have existed at all. And so ended one of history's first experiments in mass-produced convenience food, not with the triumphant expansion that its early success had seemed to promise, but with the kind of spectacular implosion that happens when human ingenuity meets human greed under conditions of insufficient oversight. The street food vendors of ancient Greece had solved the problem of feeding urban populations quickly and cheaply, but they had failed to solve the more fundamental problem of doing so safely and sustainably. The lesson, if there is one to be drawn from this particular historical catastrophe, might be that success itself can be the most dangerous enemy of any human enterprise. The vendors who built the industry were skilled craftsmen driven by pride in their work and commitment to their communities. The operators who destroyed it were profit maximizers who saw food as just another commodity to be optimized for financial return. The difference between those two approaches seems small until you're lying in bed with food poisoning, wondering whether your soup was supposed to taste like leather. Perhaps the most striking aspect of the whole saga is how familiar it feels to anyone living in the modern world, where food production has once again become industrialized, globalized, and increasingly separated from the communities it serves. The ancient Greek vendors who stretched their olive oil with cheaper alternatives and disguised spoiled fish with creative seasonings were pioneers of practices that would be instantly recognizable to contemporary food safety inspectors, if somewhat quaint in their limited scope. The psychological dynamics that drove the industry's corruption, the pressure to cut costs, the rationalization of declining standards, the assumption that customers wouldn't notice or care about quality degradation, are equally familiar to anyone who has watched modern industries prioritize short-term profits over long-term sustainability. The only real difference is that ancient vendors had to be more creative in their corner cutting because they lacked access to industrial-scale food processing technology. But there's something almost endearing about the human scale of ancient food fraud, where individual vendors personally adulterated their own products rather than delegating the task to faceless corporate bureaucracies. When your local sausage maker mixed questionable proteins into his products, at least you knew who to blame when you got sick. There was a certain honesty in the direct relationship between vendor and victim that's been lost in our more sophisticated systems of mass food production. The environmental impact of the street food collapse also seems remarkably familiar to anyone who has watched modern food systems struggle with waste disposal, pollution, and resource depletion. The ancient vendors who contaminated wells and poisoned neighborhoods were working on a smaller scale than their modern counterparts, but they were pioneering techniques that would eventually be perfected by industrial agriculture and processed food production. What's perhaps most tragic about the whole story is how completely the institutional knowledge was lost when the industry collapsed. Generations of accumulated wisdom about food preservation, preparation, and service simply vanished when the economic and social structures that supported them were destroyed. The baby was thrown out with the bathwater, and the baby in this case included genuinely valuable innovations that might have been worth preserving under better management. The social consequences of the street food disaster, the loss of community gathering places, the breakdown of informal information networks, the elimination of economic opportunities for ambitious individuals also resonate with contemporary concerns about the impact of economic disruption on social cohesion. When an industry that has become integral to daily life suddenly disappears, the effects ripple through society in ways that are often invisible until years later. Yet perhaps the most important lesson from this ancient catastrophe is that civilizations are remarkably resilient, even when they make spectacular mistakes. Athens survived the collapse of its street food industry, just as it survived wars, plagues, political upheavals, and various other disasters. People adapted, found new ways to feed themselves, and continued the grand human experiment of living together in large groups without killing each other too frequently. And somewhere in the ruins of the ancient agora, Archaeologists occasionally uncover fragments of cooking equipment, serving vessels, and food preparation tools that remind us that once upon a time, in the shadow of the Parthenon, ordinary people were just trying to grab a quick lunch between meetings, satisfy a late-night craving for something sweet, or share a meal with friends after a long day of work. They failed spectacularly at creating a sustainable food system, but they succeeded brilliantly at being human. And really, in the long sweep of history, perhaps that's the more important achievement, even if it doesn't make for particularly appetizing dinner conversation.